Weitz is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, a nonpartisan policy research organization based in Washington, and he is joining me tonight with more on this. Mr. Weitz, thank you for your time. Can you begin by giving us your view on this ceasefire? How fragile is it?
Well, first, thank you for having me. These ceasefires are very difficult, especially in the early stages. As your viewers will probably recall, during the Bosnia and other former Yugoslav conflicts, we went through dozens of ceasefires because the problem is if it has to occur throughout the front line, if one unit or one group starts violating it, the whole thing can become unstable. So I'm not surprised there's been evidence that in some places the ceasefire is not holding, at least initially.
The rhetoric between the U.S. and Russia seems to be heating up. What are your thoughts on the role of the United States, and are they helping Georgia? They're certainly standing behind them, but are they helping them?
Well, I think until today, you could say that the U.S. commitment was primarily declaratory and rhetorical. But I thought the president took a very bold move in sending in U.S. troops to distribute humanitarian aid, because in theory, you could envision a scenario where they would come into conflict with Russian troops if the Russian troops were to continue to move deeper into Georgia. So it's a very, it basically puts American soldiers' lives on the front line, and theoretically would make the Russians hesitant to violate the ceasefire to that great an extent.
How do you think the conflict between Georgia and Russia is going to affect divisions among other European countries?
Well, as we saw earlier at the Bucharest summit, there was a division between the United States and Canada and some other countries, particularly Eastern Europe countries, who wanted to accelerate the entry of Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, and some of the West European countries which were concerned that that could be very provocative to Russia and best to wait on that.
So this is a what if, but if Georgia had today become a part of NATO, where would we be now if it had gone through last spring?
It's hard to say. Certainly we've ended out with an outcome we really didn't want. If it had been allowed to enter NATO, although that was never on the cards, immediate NATO membership. If there had been a step taken to accelerate the membership process, it's unclear. Russia might have just acted all the more aggressively earlier, or it might have deterred the Russians. Certainly, if part of NATO, then the alliance commitments would require the allies to consider using force against Russia to preserve Georgia's territorial integrity.
And talk to us about Ukraine, watching this situation very closely. How come?
Ukraine is probably the most difficult, in the most difficult situation of all the other former Soviet republics with respect to what's happening in Georgia, because the Ukrainians have a similar kind of problem. You've got a large Russian minority concentrated in certain regions, Crimea. You have the governments of Russia and government of Ukraine feuding over possible NATO membership for Ukraine. The Ukrainian president is very close to the Georgian president, and the Russians have been accusing the Ukrainians of providing aid and comfort to the Georgians. So it will be interesting to see as we proceed forward to what extent what the Russians are doing in respect to Georgia, they try and take a tougher line in Ukraine. That will help us understand better how isolated the situation is in Georgia, or whether it's a more sweeping change in Russian foreign policy towards the other former Soviet republics and perhaps the West as a whole.
All right, Richard Weitz, thanks for joining us tonight. Appreciate it.
Again, thank you so much for having me.
Bye-bye now.